So here's another point of history showing the progressive movement for what it is. Remember that the progressive movement was born out of the eugenics movement, so superior Nordic whites could keep all of those inferior races at bay. Pretty much every progressive policy to this day has its roots in eugenics. We've talked before how this is the case with things like minimum wage, Social Security, and zoning, and guess what? It's the case with gun control as well. Progressives today are desperately trying to tie Second Amendment supporters to white supremacists, but this doesn't make any sense. White supremacists have historically been against the right to keep and bear arms because it makes it more difficult for them to act against blacks and other people they considered inferior. Almost immediately, gun control was used to stop blacks from owning guns. Despite the fact that many black people had served with distinction in the Revolutionary War, in 1792, the federal government passed a law saying that no black person could be part of a state militia. Louisiana forbade blacks from using firearms, even in self-defense. In Florida and Delaware, even free blacks had to get a license to carry firearms. After the Civil War, gun control laws were enacted everywhere expressly for the purpose of keeping newly freed blacks in their place. One big reason was so that blacks could not defend themselves from actions by the Ku Klux Klan, which actually started out as a gun control organization. Frederick Douglass spoke out against state and local infringement of individual private gun ownership, saying, "The work of the abolitionists is not finished. Notwithstanding the provision in the Constitution of the United States that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, the black man has never had the right either to keep or bear arms, and the legislatures of the states will still have the power to forbid it." In the special report of the 1867 Paris Anti-Slavery Conference, they found, quote, "At the South, the dragon spirit of slavery remained in all its malignity, and true to its nature, attempted in every way to make emancipation a failure. It enacted cruel and tyrannical laws against the defenseless freedmen, whereby the most grievous outrages could be inflicted upon them with impunity. Their testimony against their white assailants was not allowed in the courts. They were not permitted to own or bear firearms in self-defense. In a single district, in a single month, 49 cases of violence upon them, ranging from assault and battery to murder, in which the whites were the aggressors, were reported." By the way, when you're looking through laws of this era and you see freedmen, they're talking about blacks. They would literally go through the laws and replace the word slave with freedman. They passed laws making firearms more expensive, exactly like they want to do and have done today in order to keep them out of the hands of freed slaves. They also passed licensing laws and other restrictions, exactly like they want to do and have done today, and violators who were white only paid a small fine, but blacks were sent to chain gangs. A lot of these laws were known as black codes. For example, black codes in Mississippi stipulated a $10 fine, $700 in today's money, for possessing a firearm while black. And that was one of the better ones. In Florida, the penalty was being put in a pillory and whipped for an hour. You couldn't even get out of it by being a veteran. Black Army vets who kept their guns were often arrested. Jim Crow laws were also employed. For example, some states had a requirement that you had to register to vote to be able to carry a firearm, and the way they kept blacks from registering to vote is the stuff of legend. They knew that arming blacks would give them a defense against lynch mobs because that actually happened. Ida B. Wells Barnett spoke of a lynching that never occurred because their intended victim was armed, and said, quote, "The lesson this teaches, and which every Afro-American should ponder well, is that a Winchester rifle should have a place of honor in every black home, and it should be used for that protection which the law refuses to give. When the white man, who is always the aggressor, knows he runs his great risk of biting the dust every time his Afro-American victim does, he will have greater respect for Afro-American life." After a thwarted lynching, the Florida legislature enacted a licensing requirement, again, exactly like they want to do and have done today. Of this law, Florida Supreme Court Justice Rivers H. Buford wrote in his opinion in Watson v. Stone, quote, "The act was passed for the purpose of disarming the Negro laborers and to give the white citizens in sparsely settled areas a better feeling of security. The statute was never intended to be applied to the white population and in practice has never been so applied." It was also used to keep civil rights activists disarmed in the 50s and 60s. Martin Luther King Jr., in fact, tried applying for a concealed carry permit and was denied despite the fact that he met every single requirement of the law, except the unwritten one about skin color, that is. But that was why he moved to a platform of nonviolence. He knew the government wasn't going to let his people be armed. And for good, to them, reason. It was armed black communities that started the civil rights movement to begin with. Charles E. Cobb Jr. said, "I'm very much concerned with how the history of the Southern Freedom Movement or Civil Rights Movement is portrayed, and I'm very conscious of the gaps in the history. And one important gap in the history, in the portrayal of the movement, is the role of guns in the movement. I worked in the South. I lived with families in the South. There was never a family I stayed with that didn't have a gun. I know from personal experience and the experiences of others that guns kept people alive, kept communities safe, and all you have to do to understand this is simply to think of black people as human beings, and they're going to respond to terrorism the way anybody else would." One thing that tells you just about everything you need to know about progressives is that they'll never tell you this. They may even lie about it. But as Cobb says, William Worthy, who was a journalist, tried to sit down in an armchair in Martin King's house and was warned by Bayard Rustin, who was with him, that he was about to sit down on a couple of guns. King was a man of the South, after all, and he responded to terrorism, he responded to violence, the way most people in the South would be inclined to respond. So when the Klan bombed his house in 1956, he went to the sheriff's office and applied for a gun permit to carry a concealed weapon. Now, he didn't get the permit, but Martin King always acknowledged, if you read his writings, the right to self-defense. Armed self-defense. By the way, all of these actions against civil rights activists were done by Democrats. The civil rights movement started among Republicans, and the Civil Rights Act was introduced in 1957. Democratic Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson sent the bill to the Judiciary Committee and made sure it was watered down. Democratic Senator Strom Thurmond engaged in the longest one-person filibuster in history to try and stop it. The act that finally passed was watered down so much it was completely ineffective. Faced with growing public sentiment in favor of civil rights, confirmed racist Lyndon Johnson, now president, led the charge among congressional Democrats to sabotage the act. They added anti-business and pro-women clauses in an attempt to make the act so odious it wouldn't get passed. Now, they laughably claim to be the heroes behind the civil rights movement, a movement that was only successful because blacks were arming themselves. And to this day, Democrats scream for gun control laws that disadvantage black people greatly. Excluding gang members, white people are more likely to carry a gun without a permit, but black people are more likely to be jailed for it. And while most black Americans don't have to worry about the Klan anymore, they do have to worry about drug gangs in many places. But those are exactly the places where they had the strictest gun laws. They don't stop the criminal drug dealers, duh, but they do stop law-abiding blacks from having a means of defending themselves. Gee, it's almost like they want blacks to be killed off, which was how the progressive movement started to begin with, a movement of eugenics using gun control, minimum wage, and other policies to try and eliminate blacks and other undesirables from society. They haven't changed their policies one whit, only their rhetoric. Until next time, stay strong and be free.